Let us present to you one version, that is just a version of reflection, and we are not claiming that this is the case, but as an assumption, why not think it through? So, let's reflect on what a Russian victory would look like. If you look at a map of Eurasia, there are three main areas where Americans have settled. First of all, it is Europe, the main citadel, the main pillar of the United States outside North America, an area simply oversaturated with military bases. The main players in the region are Germany, Britain, and France. They also have a whole proxy army there. It's a neighboring country to us that we're in conflict with right now. The second is the Middle East. Here the main pillar of the US is Israel, the vicar of US interests. However, Americans have also settled on numerous legal and illegal bases in Syria, Qatar, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and so on. Turkey, although a strong player and NATO member, is still breaking from a purely pro-American agenda thanks to Erdogan. Finally, the Far East, where the US projects its power through Japan and South Korea, as well as Taiwan. Now to make a long story short, what's happening in the world right now? The world is divided into spheres of influence. This means that Eurasia must get out from under the influence of the US entirely. That is, as long as the Americans are present on the Eurasian continent, the fight against them will continue. The US itself has named who its enemy is: Russia, Iran, China, and North Korea. In fact, they are not lying, because each of these countries is responsible for a different sector of squeezing the US out of Eurasia. Russia was the first to do so on February 24, 2022. All this can be regarded as a struggle with NATO, aimed at weakening NATO with the task of at least squeezing the Americans out of NATO and the task of at most eliminating all NATO, and ideally, that it should dissolve itself without a military clash. Iran is responsible for pushing the US out of the Middle East, and it may have been this operation that began on October 7, but that's just a guess. China and North Korea are the third element, and they are extremely likely to launch their own operations similar to the Russian and Iranian operations. And just like Russia with Iran, not through a direct confrontation with the Americans, but through some kind of proxy. Maybe those proxies will be the North Koreans themselves, who will attack South Korea. We can also add that Russia is helping to squeeze the US out of the Middle East through the operation in Syria, which started back in 2015 but may soon enter a new phase, and may also help squeeze them out of the Far East. Thus, what is happening now in the west of our country is only a small episode of a big confrontation, which is just beginning, and the victory will be the moment when all American bases will leave Eurasia. Some will ask why China has tolerated the antics of the US and why it doesn't openly help Russia. For example, when American Nancy Pelosi brazenly flew into Taiwan, it looked like a slap in the face to China, and many people then either laughed at its weakness or were genuinely worried about its lack of strength and resolve. However, if one accepts as true the conspiracy theory I outlined above, a lot of things fall into place. Let's see: Russia, Iran, China, and North Korea together plot the unthinkable, to completely squeeze the Americans out of Eurasia. Russia is in charge of European direction, Iran is in charge of the Middle East, and China and North Korea must kick the Americans out of Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. So, if such a conspiracy really exists, it makes sense why China didn't immediately launch an operation in Taiwan, as everyone expected a couple years ago. Remember when only a lazy person didn't say it was about to start? Moreover, the Americans themselves were expecting it, even more so, they desired it. They've been preparing for this, and to make China more hesitant, they even set up a provocation with Nancy Pelosi. However, China abstained because it was important to drag the US into a long and grueling conflict that the US itself had no idea about. For them, after all, the war with Russia in our neighboring countries seemed like an easy victory. 20,000 sanctions, a bunch of weapons, 6 months of time, and that's it, Russia is gone. But almost 2 years have passed. The Americans have to lie that Russia is weakening, while in fact only Europe, that is, their main citadel, is weakening. And the Americans are sorry to abandon what they have started, because every time there is some light at the end of the tunnel, some hope that Russia will lose, and they continue to send weapons, money, resources. As a result, they've gotten so deep into it that there's no way to get out. Or rather it will, but it will be such a reputational blow that NATO may not be able to withstand it. And now after this US restraint in our neighboring country, with which we are in conflict, comes the second phase. Middle East. Americans approached it with a budget deficit of $2 trillion, with the national debt growing by $1 trillion every couple of months, and with a sponger in the form of our neighboring country, with which we have a conflict, which we cannot abandon. But Israel can't be abandoned either. China, however, is keeping itself in check and continues to show that it is not particularly ready to openly help anyone, get involved in a conflict and so on. It's as if he's letting Americans know, don't worry, waste resources on the conflict in Europe and now also on Israel. Everything will be calm in Taiwan until you yourself ignite this conflict, everything is under your control. Yes, a false sense of control is what gives China's passivity to Americans. And they're trying to keep from a major war in the Middle East right now. But if they succeed, the financial and resource hole will begin to grow exponentially. And then, in the third phase, the next conflict will open up, in Taiwan, South Korea and Japan. The US will approach it completely bankrupt. Though in fairness they are already bankrupt, for to create new trillion-dollar debts to pay off old ones is bankruptcy. What's the next development? The US will have to choose which boar to slaughter, because there's no way to get all three. And their trouble is that whichever ally they ditch, it will mean, first, their total defeat in this direction, European, Middle Eastern or Far Eastern, with the subsequent withdrawal of US troops from the region. Second, the heaviest reputational blow, which will affect the other two areas as well. Third, the possibility of Russia, Iran, China to fight not on three, but on two directions, which will further aggravate the situation of the United States. In short, the intent of the anti-American axis is to boil the frog slowly, to prevent it from sensing danger and jumping out of the cauldron early. The Americans thought they were the smartest and that they were the ones who were slowly cooking Russia. But no, there is a much larger and more strategic Eurasian agenda looming over all this. And by the way, to keep this plot undetected, Russia, China, and Iran are doing their best to deny that they are helping each other. Even the Americans themselves have only now come to the realization that there is a certain axis of evil of three countries. Although this axis took shape a long time ago, it was just skillfully disguised. Once again, this is just a version of thinking. I'm not claiming it is, but as an assumption, why not think about it? Well, now let's move to the US to see what's really going on there. For this purpose, let us quote Zbigniew Brzezinski, his statement of April 1997. So, quote, "The collapse of its rival, the Soviet Union, left the United States in a unique position. They became the first and only truly world power, and yet America's global dominance is in some respects reminiscent of earlier empires, despite their more limited regional scope. These empires based their power on a hierarchy of vassal-dependent states, protectorates and colonies, and all those outside the empire were generally regarded as barbarians. To some extent, this anachronistic terminology is not so inappropriate for a number of states currently under American influence. As in the past, America's application of imperial power is largely the result, now most importantly, of the organization's superior ability to rapidly mobilize vast economic and technological resources for military purposes, the implicit but significant cultural appeal of the American way of life, and the dynamism and generated competitive spirit of the American social political elite. End of statute. Now let's look at what those signs look like now. 1. A superior organization. Well, judging by the problems in Congress, which has failed several times in a row to appoint a Speaker of the House of Representatives on any given tour, judging by the fact that decisions to increase budget deficit limits are made at the last minute, judging by the deepest divisions in government, with the administration, legislature, and law enforcement defiantly sabotaging the president's judgment. That's me talking about Trump. There's no superior organization, no organization at all. 2. The ability to rapidly mobilize vast economic and technological resources for military purposes. There's nothing to talk about at all. The US has lost any ability to rapidly increase production. Economic resources? You're kidding me. The US is in the deepest financial crisis and has been de facto bankrupt for a long time. They realize that they are unable to repay their national debt under any circumstances. And it already costs more to maintain than military expenditures. Technological resources, pardon me, they are mostly outsourced to other countries. 3. Significant cultural appeal of the American way of life. Well, the facts speak for themselves. The culture of abolition, the culture of minorities, the culture of homelessness, the culture of the opiate epidemic, the culture of the rapidly impoverishing middle class. Here's today's American way of life. What is its appeal? For whom? Except for Europe, which the US has made even less appealing. 4. The dynamism and innate competitive spirit of the American social and political elite. The dynamism of a political elite that has been sitting in its seats for 50 years, I mean Congress, and which has turned into a gerontocracy worse than the Politburo of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union? No, the spirit of rivalry is still there, but it has reached a level where it is on the verge of civil war and can go over the edge at any moment. On the most unexpected occasion. Why go far? The results of a recent poll speak for themselves. Americans are willing to piss on political opponents literally, with the number of citizens so inclined hovering around 50% for both parties. In short, it has come to this. Of the qualities that made America attractive to its vassals, none of them remain today. The US is practically bankrupt, and already almost all countries are looking for ways to crawl out from under the dollar as a settlement currency, and as a reserve currency too. Once there is a consensus on what should replace it, oh, don't envy Americans. The US should have refused to pay back its debts 15 years ago, before 2008, when it still had something left of its military might. Now it's not military power, it's military might. But if they send an aircraft carrier strike group somewhere, they will quickly sink it to the bottom, and not even Russia or China, other, much less militarily powerful countries have such abilities. The land operation of American troops is not talked about without convulsive laughter already by their own experts. Troops trained in inclusiveness and respect for minority rights, which is what more time is now being spent on than combat alignment. Troops that are full of overweight people who are not physically fit and addicted to substances, but we have seen that even in Iraq or Afghanistan they are not able to stand up to the skinny-clad and slipper-shoe-wearing mujahideen. Generally speaking, woe to the vanquished, though the vanquished do not yet realize that they are vanquished.